Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Angela Hall. I'm director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Thank you for coming to the event tonight, Unbroken, Disrupting Toxic Colonialism with Angela Sterritt. I just wanted to begin by recognizing that we're on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Delighted that you could be with us today. SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement has been located here since the SFU School for Contemporary Arts moved from Burnaby Mountain into the downtown Eastside neighborhood. We're proud members of the downtown Eastside community. Once again this year, for the 14th straight year, we'll be participating in the Heart of the City Festival, which happens in the downtown Eastside. There's a number of events. There'll be a guide that will be coming out, so please do check out all those events that will be happening. About half a dozen of them will be here in the space. Just a couple of housekeeping things. The bathrooms are just outside the doors. Immediately following the event, there's going to be a reception in the World Arts Center on the second floor and a book signing with Angela. Moderating today is my friend Ginger Gitxsan-Myers. She's Nisga'a and Kwakwaka'wakw, whose 20-plus year career challenging colonial systems is creating new pathways for radical change. She's the first Indigenous fellow with SFU's Morris J. Wask Center for Dialogue, where she focuses on decolonization, urban Indigenous policy, and planning. She played an integral role in making Vancouver the world's first official city of reconciliation, which was an outgrowth of her work on the landmark Environics Urban Indigenous People Study, the first comprehensive research of its kind in Canada. Ginger's also the first ever Indigenous chair of Greenpeace Canada. So please join me in welcoming Ginger.
Thank you, Am. It's a real honor to be here to be moderating a conversation with my good friend, Angela Sterritt. All of you who are here have probably read her phenomenal book, Unbroken. And I just want to hold my hands up in recognition of the bravery and honesty that Angela put forward in this groundbreaking book that just shed light on what it was like to be an Indigenous young woman, walking through Canada and the US at a time when we were utterly invisible and totally marginalized. And the stories that Ange shared were just gut-wrenching reflections of what it was like to be young, female, and Indigenous. And it feels serendipitous that she grew into this powerful truth teller in her work as an award-winning investigative journalist, which had seen her spend a lot of time at CBC, where you would see her just phenomenal reporting on the news, the work that she did to uncover, I think, the horrendous treatment of the health-sick grandfather and his granddaughter, and how they were handcuffed, just trying to start a bank account, and the bank not recognizing that their Indian status cards were legitimate IDs. And her, her super interesting podcast, Land Back. It just provided, for me, I felt like this was the first time that I was hearing my perspectives and stories from my lens resonating in a lot of the issues that we as Indigenous peoples talk about. You know, the importance of title, the importance of seeing your culture survive, the importance of a hereditary chief system within First Nations communities, and of course the role of young people in all of this. So through all of her stories, she's always given us so much of herself, and so excited to have her here with us today. She is a phenomenal Gitxsan woman, Proud to have her as a friend, and I would like to welcome Angela Sterritt to share her powerful presentation with us today.
Thank you so much for those words, Ginger. I didn't expect that, and much appreciated and much love from another powerful matriarch in our community who does so much for our community, for our people. And it's so nice to see people out tonight. It's another fine, rainy evening in Vancouver, so thank you for making the time. Make sure this works. Okay. I think it takes like a couple seconds to go back, maybe. There we go. All right. Simgiget sigidim ha nach gankable wilksit luam godi wingeasam atamasatun Angela Sterritt lu algia zumk beast waya Gick-san Lakibu Wilp Wiik'aax Walter Sterritt ya Gitxsan ni'i. Hello, and thank you again for being here, and thank you for having me. Also, I want to thank the Tsleil-Waututh, the Musqueam, and the Squamish for having us on their ancestral, current, and stolen lands today. It's weird to be not walking around. Usually I'm walking around, so I'm kind of like, I'm adjusting here, so bear with me. How's everybody doing, by the way? You good? Thumbs up? Okay, awesome. So I just shared a little bit about who I am as well. So on my mother's side, my beautiful late mother, Delphine Beaulieu, was from a small, tiny island in Newfoundland called Belle Island, and she had Irish and English roots from the Isles of Jersey. It's super important for me to recognize my white side and really investigate those roots, especially knowing that my family was here for generations and how they came to maintain, build, or tacitly consent to colonial systems that harm Indigenous people. I often hear people say, well, I'm just Canadian, I can be whatever I want. Well, that's a privilege. So it's incredibly important for those of us who have that privilege to use it to dismantle white supremacy, structural violence, and colonial violence that exists today. It's not of the past. I also shared a little bit about my Gitxsan side. So my father, Chuck Sterritt, my late father, was Gitxsan from the House of we-GAK, the House of the Big Wings, and from the Wolf Clan, the Lucky Boo, and from the community of Gitanmaax in Gitxsan territory. So his father, my grandfather, Walter Sterritt, was groomed most of his young life to be the Smogiet, the hereditary chief of we-GAK, the wee men. People would bring him small gifts. It was known his entire young life that this is who he would grow to become. In modern day context, that takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of resources, and it takes a lot of time. So we actually said no to that role. And my uncle, his brother, Neil Sterritt, took the role until he passed away recently at the young age of 107. We have good genes. And so I also shared my name, Lu Algia Zumkbeast. So last year, I was gifted my name. So our culture, I don't know if people know this, but many of our Northwest culture, Gingers as well, Nisga'a, Tsimshian, Kwakwaka'wakw, we're matrilineal people. So if our mothers are non-Gitxsan, we need to be formally, legally brought into our community by way of auntie, high-ranking member of our house group. And so that was going to be happening for me. So my elder, in preparation for the feast hall that would happen, feast hall system, she sent me an email about what my name would be and what it would mean. At the same time, I was quitting my job as a longtime radio, television host, and reporter at the national broadcaster. And I get this email as I'm on my way to quit my job, and it says, your Gitxsan name will be Lu'algia Zumkbeast, which means woman who works in television and radio. I thought, okay, our name, I get it, our names are not prophetic, our names are literal, but the literal translation of it is woman who talks in boxes. And so I thought, geez, like, I thought it was so important all these years. I'm on television telling the truth to millions of people, and it's diminished to talks and boxes. But our people have a way with humility. It's a really important value among our people, and it's not about feeling down about yourself. It's recognizing that there's always room for growth. There's always room for change. In fact, we leave mistakes on our button blankets to signify that there's always space for improvement. So what I just shared with you there is something that Indigenous people are very wealthy and we're very rich in, but that Canadian society has told us we don't have, and that's a sense of belonging and connection. So today I want to talk to you about the power of story. I want to talk to you about the power of truth, and I want to talk to you about the supernatural power of change. Because we definitely need change in this society right now, don't we? We're living in some incredibly polarizing times, some of the most polarizing times and violent times that I have witnessed in my entire life. We absolutely need to, at the very minimum, believe Indigenous people when they tell us their truths. And we definitely need to speak out. As the adage goes, no more silence. That silence, unfortunately, is something we've become so comfortable and content with in Canada. And I think it's become a way of protecting ourselves from admitting the things that we're not so proud of. We may shy away from the things we're not proud of. We may not want to touch them or look at them. But as those like Gabriel Maté says, in order for us to heal it, we have to face it, right? When we choose to face the pain, when we choose to face the wrongs, when we choose to face the mistakes that our people have committed, the reality that there's a huge lack of safety for Indigenous people, a deficit in human security for Indigenous people, we have to face that and we have to come to terms with it so that we can realize that we can transmute it and we can create a better home, better relationships, a better academia, and a better country that we are proud of. We can do that individually, but doesn't it feel better when we heal, when we grow together as a collective? That's something that we're also at a deficit in our society, especially with the pandemic and social media, as working in silos, working as individuals. It's also a tenet of white supremacist culture, is individual power, rather than looking at ourselves as part of a collective. My dad used to say something to me when I was a kid. We used to spend a lot of time on the land. He actually went into the logging industry when he was 11 years old. I can't even get my 13-year-old to do dishes, so I can't even imagine being that young, working in the horse logging industry. So he was a logger most of our life, and he was also a hunter. So we'd spend a lot of times outside. And when the night sky would be dark and we'd look and we'd see the first star, he'd always say, "You always wish for the same thing every time you make a wish. When you blow out your birthday candles, you always wish for the same thing." And I thought, that's so stupid. The thing that he'd wish for, that's so dumb. And it is really cliche, to be honest. But he said, "You always wish for world peace." And he said, "You always wish for that because when you wish for world peace, that affects you too. You're part of the world." That's peace is something we're in such short supply of today, right? When we think of what's happening in Gaza, in Palestine, in Congo, in Lebanon, when we think about what's happening here in Canada, that there's been a genocide, that there continues to be colonial violence that they live with to this day. Indigenous women and girls were not afforded the same peace as everyone else in Canada. We're not afforded the same right and access to human security, it seems. Indigenous women and girls are more likely to experience violence than any other race of females in this country. We are 12 times as likely to go missing or be murdered than any other race of females in this country, and 16 times as likely as white women. We are 8 times as likely to be murdered by a serial killer. My Twitter, I still call it Twitter, I don't care what anyone says, but it's been blowing up lately. Every time I post something about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, I get probably 20 tweets that say, yeah, and who's doing all the killing? I say, you know exactly who's doing the killing. Robert Pickton, Cody Labochkov, Michael Sabiki, and I probably am saying that guy's name wrong, but he was the guy who murdered 4 Indigenous women who ended up in the Winnipeg landfill. When his name surfaced and journalists started looking into him, they found his Facebook and it was littered with white supremacist posts. These are the people that kill Indigenous women and girls, despite what's put out there that it is Indigenous men. And just so people know this, that information, that rumor was put out by the Chief of Police in Canada in 2015, and he has still yet to provide data or any indication of where that information comes from, because it's just not true. Because of the colonial hangover of anti-Indigenous systemic female violence and violence against Indigenous people, it means that every day that we leave the house, we might not make it home alive. This is Ramona Wilson. She's one of the young women that I talk about in my book and one of the thousands of women that have gone missing or murdered in this country. Our lack of safety as Indigenous people could not be punctuated more by the reality that we are 10 times as likely as white people to be shot and killed by police. And that fact could not be punctuated more by the reality that there's been, in the last month and a half, nearly 10 Indigenous people who've been shot and killed by police or killed by police in Canada. When it is baked into every layer of your existence, physically built into the architecture of who you are, that they will find a way to make you more vulnerable. There's a hardening happenings, a survival, a reality, that there is no one out there is no institution out there that will protect you. This is the reality that Indigenous people live with in today. Before I left CBC, there was a report that we put out, and it was an analysis of the missing and murdered, the National Inquiry looking to missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that came out in 2019. They released around 260 calls to justice. By 2023, how many of those calls to justice do you think were completed? Anyone can shout out. Are you guys all journalists? So jaded. 2. So 2 were completed by 2023. So the host of the show says, well, what does that tell you? What does that data tell you? And I said, it sends a strong message out to the world, doesn't it? That we don't matter. And that's the exact opposite of how we're treated in our own communities. As a Gitxsan person, we have our ayuk, we have our laws that have protected our women, our children, our boys, our men, our gender diverse and our gender expansive relatives, our elders, our majagali, tiny little flowers also means children, for tens of thousands of years. We've sustained the environment, the climate, created justice, created government systems that have kept our people and our laws and our land intact. So how do we get to that place? How do we get to that place where we're treated? And sorry, this is a slide that I missed. So this is the 9 people that were murdered over the last month and a half by police in Canada, all Indigenous people, relatives. So how do we get to a place in Canada where we're treated, where we're regarded in the same way that we are by our own people? I often say it's through story, and hoping that our stories will teach people, that people will finally believe us. When the 2015 final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out in 2015, I heard from thousands of Indigenous people who said having people believe us is healing because nobody has. We used to call it, or we still call it, Gaslight Nation. But I'm starting to wonder, how long can we be on this learning journey for, when people will finally believe Indigenous people, when we'll finally come to grips with the truth? But it's about leaning into discomfort that we might feel within our own organizations. Disrupting colonial laws and narratives, though, is really about one thing, and I thought about this a lot. It boils down to one thing, that Indigenous people and people of color are getting disciplined for and fired from their jobs right now about, and that's speaking out. And I'm going to talk more about that. But first, I want to talk about what the government's idea of rectifying the wrongs of the past were. September 30th marked Truth and Reconciliation Day. I think this was our second year. I could be wrong. It was supposed to be a day that I don't believe was done in consultation with Indigenous people, that the government decided would be a national day for reflection. It would be a government-mandated holiday. The first year that went by, it was very hopeful. I saw a sea of orange shirts. And while that may seem like maybe a small gesture, it was a big thing for family members who had watched their relatives survive or not survive residential school. It was an important way to say, we honor you, we see you. I was in Ottawa this September 30th, and I decided I would just spend the day in Settler Society. So I went to a mall, I went to restaurants, I walked around the streets. I didn't go to any events. I saw maybe 3 orange shirts, which was nice to see. But I saw people, I also was in Toronto the day before, I saw people raving about how great it was to have this long weekend. They were treating it like a May 24 holiday weekend. And this post, by the way, this poster was on a CIBC in Vancouver. Enjoy your holiday. What have we learned from this day, right? What are we taking away from this day? September 30th this year marked nearly 10 years since the government's 2015 promising to implement all 94 calls to justice, calls to action put out by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. From 2019 to 2024, the Yellowhead Institute, it's an Indigenous think tank, did an analysis to find out how many of those calls to action had been completed. And can you guess how many were completed from 2019 to 2024? So 5 were completed. I saw somebody put out a post recently that said, do you even have a favorite call to action? Do you even know one of the calls to action, the number and what it's about? And they said, my favorite is 94. It's about treaties with Indigenous people. So 10 years later, what can be done to advance reconciliation in Canada? Well, for one, you have to stop the harm to reconcile, right? I'm going to read you the definition of reconciliation, because I think when reconciliation first started to be talked about, it was, in my view, it was really being promulgated by Robert Joseph. And really, the notion was to create awareness and create healing for Indigenous people, to talk about what happened at residential school. Really important pieces. But what's happened today is people say, reconciliation means something different for everyone. Well, what happens when you have a word that has a vague meaning? It can mean something different to everybody. It has much less weight behind it. The dictionary definition, though, is the act of causing 2 people or groups to become friendly again after an argument or disagreement. So I'm going to use this analogy that was shared with me not long ago. This is how I see us trying to push for reconciliation right now, a return to friendly relations after a disagreement. For one, let's be clear, there was not a disagreement, there was colonial violence that was forced upon Indigenous people. I think we can all agree with that, right? There's no confusion around that. So you have a truck. You have a really nice truck. I don't know much truck lingo, so I'll just say it has a bunch of bells and whistles. But it's a really incredible truck. And this guy's driving it, and it's stolen from him by force. And years and years and years pass, and he's without his truck. And his moccasins are all worn out, and he's tired, and he's exhausted from walking everywhere. And one day, the guy with the truck sees him on the side of the road and says, "Hey, man," rolls down his window, "Hey, man, I just wanted to acknowledge that I've stolen your truck. Thank you." And drives away, right? It's sort of an analogy about where we're at today, because colonial violence didn't just exist in the hallways of residential school. And let's be clear that the show Friends debuted in 1994, and the last residential school was closed in 1996. So these aren't black and white pictures of the far gone past that we're thinking of. It's a very recent past. There are people, relatives of mine, who've been to residential school. As someone my age, their parents went, their grandparents went, and their great-grandparents went. I visited the St. Mary's, what was once the St. Mary's residential school, and there were 3, because they kept on burning down or things kept on happening, they kept on building more. And multi-generations of families went there. As Stafford Beer surmised, the purpose of a system is what it does. The purpose of a system is what it does. So in other words, it's not a system's intentions, but the outcome that are a more honest measure of the objective. Very important in the context of Canada, right? In terms of how we position ourselves to the world. We are in a process of colonization right now. It's not something of the past. And I think I went backwards by mistake. So this is my uncle, Neil Sterritt. He's at the front. He's wearing an amhalite, that's our headdresses. You can only receive a headdress in our culture as a very high-ranking member. And this is my family members, and they used to sit on my back porch in East Van when I was just a kid, and they'd say, "We've learned the white man's laws and the white man's words to fight with our culture in the white man's courts." And they did, and they won. I think about this picture, and I'm so proud of my relatives. I'm so proud of what they achieved. The Delgamuukw is still one of the most well-known Aboriginal rights and title cases of our time. We didn't get our hundreds of thousands of kilometers of land that was stolen from us, but we did get the right to see our laws as just the same as the English law, the common law, in court. There's been court cases just like this, the Haida, the Tsilhqot'in. In fact, there's been 300 court cases just like this that Indigenous people have won. And the government, to this day, the BC Crown and the Canadian government continues to take Indigenous people to court to access more land, to steal more land. That is happening right now. The Canadian Crown and the British Crown both own around, and this number took a lot of research for me to find. I was asking in my podcast, literally several members of the federal government, several members of the British Columbia government, several Indigenous lawyers, what percentage of land do Indigenous people in Canada have jurisdiction over? So really, that's the definition of owning for me. A number that kept on popping up that you might hear too is 0.2%. Well, that's our reserve land. That is owned by the Canadian government, despite bylaws such as dog leash laws, for example. We don't have any jurisdiction over those laws. So the Canadian Crown owns 92% of land in this country, and the remainder 8% is privately owned. And no one, to this day, is able to give me a percentage of how much of that is owned or Indigenous people have jurisdiction over. But it's my guess that it might be 3 or 4%. So this is where we're at in Canada. This is why, for me, the discussion must move beyond reconciliation or truth-telling. We must begin to start talking about reparations. So that's land. Oh, I might have gone back. Another indication, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Another indication of where we are at in terms of promoting and maintaining colonial violence in this country is the child welfare system in Canada. You may have heard of the statistics that there's almost 80% in some provinces of Indigenous children that make up all of those who are in the child welfare system. The child welfare system has become so lucrative for non-Indigenous people in this country that some have called it a cottage industry. The most common reason, and I've talked to social workers, I've talked to those who have apprehended children, those who work inside the system as sources, the most common reason why Indigenous people are taken from their home is a box that gets ticked called neglect. What does that mean? It means they're taken away for poverty reasons. Those could be, in cases that I've done stories on, a child not having a box spring, a child not having a warm enough jacket, not being able to go afford certain supplies that they need. Poverty reasons. Think about that cottage industry. So instead, the government's great idea is to give money to non-Indigenous people, for the most part, to take on Indigenous children. Does that not seem skewed to you? Right? Indigenous people have been legislated into poverty, and that could not be punctuated more by the reserve system, the system of apartheid that was adopted by South Africa. So when we're thinking about the ways to disrupt toxic colonialism, the question I get at every single event that I do is, how can we help? What can we do? And for Indigenous people, it gets exhausting because we get asked that over and over and over again. But not only that, when you look around institutions, whether it's academia, whether it's the media, whether it's the healthcare system, whether it's the prison system, it's always Indigenous people speaking up and calling for change. I remember I went to an event that was talking about bringing down the high incarceration rates for Indigenous women and men. And there was a little tiny elder up there. And I, for some reason, imagined a very different scenario. I imagined a bunch of allies who'd built that system, who'd built that prison system, who maintained that prison system, who realized this is going horribly wrong. But it was this little tiny elder who'd worked for years and years and years to change that system. It's got to be more than Indigenous people fighting to change the wrongs in this country. It's got to be more than us speaking out. This is me at CBC, and when I give a longer keynote, I give a much longer example, or a lot more examples of my life as a journalist, as someone who grew up on the street, as someone who grew up with bullying and abuse. But becoming a journalist was a huge dream of mine, to finally tell the truth about our people from an Indigenous point of view. When I moved to Vancouver, I thought it was going to be so great. People are so much more educated here. I'd worked in Yellowknife, I'd worked in Toronto, and I'd worked in Winnipeg. And when I came here, I was told immediately, what kind of stories do you normally do? And I was like, I tell the news like everybody else. And I know, but what kind of stories? And I was like, well, I do tell a lot of Indigenous stories. And they said, well, not here. You'll tell the stories that are assigned to you. And when I did push to tell Indigenous stories, I was called bias. I was told I couldn't be trusted to tell the truth. If I told a positive Indigenous story or a negative Indigenous story, somehow I had a stake in it, even though my colleagues who were white, who were reporting on City Hall, which at the time was also all white, they would never be called bias. And so as years and years went by, fighting and fighting to tell Indigenous stories, fighting to tell Indigenous stories that included the word racism, that included the word colonialism. I couldn't use that word for years. For many years of my career, I wasn't allowed to call residential school survivors survivors. I had to call them students. We had to fight to make that change. I also had to fight for my place to belong. I talked to Jody Wilson-Raybould about this, and we had the exact same experience. You walk into a room, and everyone's either eye-rolling at you or afraid of you. But you're always that person that everyone hates in the room. Because in many cases, again, healthcare, police, media, from people, Indigenous people that I talk to all across Canada, it's only us speaking out. It's only us saying there's got to be changes here. There's got to be changes made. When I left CBC, one of the main reasons that I left was because I was in a blue sky meeting talking about how to make our working culture better for everybody. And I said, I'd like to know how you're going to commit to making this space safe for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And the person running the meeting said, look around, Angela. The majority were white people, and he said, everybody in this room has diversity within them. So when I left, I had a number of people apologizing to me, saying, I wish I'd spoken out, I wish I'd said something. I saw how you were treated. Chapter 10 in my book, by the way, if you want to learn more. And so when people talk to me about what can you do, how can we learn? For one, there are 5,000 recommendations on the internet right now, compiled by Indigenous people, from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, from the National Inquiry looking into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, from the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, from the Betty Osborne Report, and several others. 5,000 recommendations, guidance on what you can do to help. So I asked myself today, what does dismantling toxic colonialism look like? I'm writing my second book. It's about men. Whenever I say that, people are like, whoa. And I'm like, no, it's good. It's healthy men. And they're like, oh. But a lot of it is about looking at the patriarchy. A lot of it's also looking at Trump, Jim Vance, Jordan Peterson, a lot of these ideas of toxic patriarchy that are holding on to their place in the society. And so in looking at that, in looking at Trump's Project 2025, looking how much these ideas firmly mirror the ideas of those who came to this country in order to colonize Canada and viciously harmed, violently hurt our people and created systems that are so alive today. And why are they alive today? It's because we tacitly consent to them when we decide not to use our voice. I do a lot of these talks for a number of different institutions, and one of them was the healthcare system. I also give a lot of talks to the Canadian government, and they actually love me saying things like time for reparations, which blows my mind. But they often say things like, we're just a cog. And I'm like, you're a cog in a machine. Why not disrupt it instead of oiling that machine? You have a voice. You have a voice as an individual, but you also have a voice as a collective. So many people are getting fired from their jobs right now. I would definitely be fired from my job right now just for speaking about ending a genocide in another country that doesn't include killing millions of white people. Right? Indigenous people shouldn't be the ones who are educating. I did that off the side of my desk for years for free. I was a free consultant. I was a free teacher. Indigenous people right now should be focused on rebuilding our laws, our governing structures, our languages, building cohesive communities, reimagining what it looks like to live, I'm going to swear here, unfucked with by toxic colonialism. Indigenous people should be focused on reclaiming our land, not educating people about systems that we have nothing to do with. We're just harmed by them. What would happen if we started to ask questions? And going back to the healthcare system analogy, or the example, people often say, well, if I were to speak out about racism, I would get disciplined. Well, that means there's an entire culture that needs to be shifted, or more people speaking out. And speaking out isn't something that needs to be aggressive, right? A nurse in the healthcare system who was Indigenous told me, I start by asking a question. What did you mean by that? Can you repeat that? What do you think you meant by making that statement? And if it's racist, by saying that's racist. Maybe you should think about that. Maybe you should educate yourself, or maybe you should be disciplined. The federal government only this year made anti-Indigenous racism in the healthcare system, I'm not sure if this is the word, but disciplinable. It made it wrong by law. 2024. And it was able to go on to the point of death, life and death for many Indigenous people in the healthcare system. What would happen if we started to ask questions? If we viewed Indigenous people not as collapsing under colonial violence, but those who are teachers, leaders, engineers, those who have contributed to this country in the form of democracy. Democracy was created by Haudenosaunee people. We've made many contributions to this society. If we want to make changes, if we want to disrupt colonialism, we need to lean into discomfort. We need to believe Indigenous people. That's the lowest bar possible. And the lowest bar possible for me, in my experience, was to speak out. Somebody say something. Say this is wrong. This is super racist. Again, chapter 10 of my book, read it. Nobody said a word, ever. So speaking out, for me, is what you can do. If we want to disrupt toxic colonialism, we need to not be silent anymore, not be comfortable with this silence, and get uncomfortable with speaking out. Thank you. There's a lot more slides that I had to show. These are Maxwell Johnson and his granddaughter, Tori Ann. And that's me getting a button blanket. And that's, you'll see that more.
It's so hard to know where to start because the things that you talk about are the things that I have experienced in the workplace, you know, being marginalized, not being believed, or given space to speak up and then kind of letting it fall to the wayside. And you just have to wonder, what kind of society are we really if we're more comfortable putting on a smile and forgetting about it like it didn't even matter, as opposed to saying, wow, I had no idea that our workplace policies were marginalizing your worldview, because I had no idea that was something that existed. It didn't cross my mind before. Let's find a way to change it. And you would think something like that would be normal, right? Like we're in Canada, we're in a nice country, but it doesn't happen, right? So the example that you gave of the chief of police who could easily spout just an uninformed statistic, lie, about how women are actually murdered, how Indigenous women are actually murdered in this country. It's so much easier to believe that than to actually acknowledge the truth. And I sometimes wonder, like, is it just Indigenous people that this is happening to? But we have a war in Gaza right now, and our taxpayer dollars are funding this genocide in Gaza right now, right? So it's not just us who are dealing with this pacification served with lies, and everyone's just believing it. I think the analogy that I would always come back to is the emperor has no clothes, right? And how the emperor's walking through the street and he has no clothes on and everyone's going, oh, you look so good. That's a wonderful outfit that you're wearing, and he's naked. And then these little kids further down the line are going, what are you talking about? He's not wearing anything. Can't you see he's not wearing anything? And it feels like that's the society that we're in, right? And so it's toxic, but it's invisible.
I think it's frustrating too, because I think, as you talked about at the very beginning, for so long we were invisible. It was like we were completely erased, right? Unless we were performing our indigeneity for people. And it gets to the point where today, where there's been, in some regards, remarkable changes, right? Like, for example, in the media, when I first started, I remember trying to get one Indigenous story on air would be impossible. Or it would be like a story about Indigenous history in Stanley Park, and it'd be a white anthropologist telling it. And I just remember being like, I remember then being like, we're so far, we're here. Like, I think that was 2018. And that's still a push from non-Indigenous journalists, is to have white experts on Indigenous people to make it more valid or something. So we've made remarkable changes. Like, if you look at, CTV, Global, CBC, not to mention countless smaller papers that I started my career at that have been publishing Indigenous stories for years and years and years and years. But there's now, tons of stories populated. So it's important that we do see the gains that we've made. But sometimes it does feel like you're radical for just wanting to move the dial this much, And I think we made remarkable changes in 2021, right? 2020, people, I was like, remember 2020 and 2021, where people were able to slow down and say, oh my gosh, like, you know, whether it was through the murder of George Floyd or the, I always say learning about, because Indigenous people, I mean, the TRC report talked about in 2015, the 4,000 children that never made it home, right? People learning about this for the first time, about the children that died at residential school. So many things happened, but I think it was that we had time to think and space to think. But then it kind of seemed like we started to go backwards, you know? And that's a scary place to be. And when people are being penalized for speaking out about a genocide, it blows my mind. And people keep on saying, oh, you know, history will one day come out. And I'm like, will it? Or will the history continue to be twisted? Like, when will it come out? Like, how many more need to die? You know, so it's at like a whole new level of silencing and penalizing those who speak the truth right now that I find particularly disarming.
Yeah. I'm going to read a passage from your book. It's one of the final chapters, and in it you're talking about when the unmarked graves at Gitanmaax were found. Well, they didn't even know what was there. They just knew, because of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they knew that they had to find all of these children who just went missing. And one of the ways that they thought they could find out where these children ended up was by looking in the grounds of the residential schools, because there were so many stories of children who died there. Their parents were never notified. You'd have children who would see their brother or sister being taken away in the middle of the night, and then they were never seen again, right? So where did the children go? And so the passage in the book is, we're all learning about this for the first time. It's 2021, and you had been talking to Chief Roseanne Kashmir from Gitanmaax, Secwepemc. Those who once treated so many Indigenous people with frank disregard in BC were now asking for us to help teach them about what happened. While it was exhausting to be educating a group who had seen Indigenous people as irrelevant until 5 minutes ago, it felt like this was the time to talk about everything from colonial violence to the Indian Act to genocide. That summer on Canada Day, instead of celebrating Canada by waving red and white flags, Canadians were wearing orange shirts to reflect upon those that never made it home or survived residential school. People were forced to unwind the tightly knit coils of lies that Canada was a country built on peace and diversity, and reckon with the truth. It was time to truly listen to Indigenous people. When I started my book in 2015, racism was a no-no to talk about in the journalism industry. In 2017, colonization was questioned in my stories. In 2019, journalists were not to give the reality of genocide in Canada any weight. In 2021, all these rules began to break. So I'll acknowledge that we have made significant progress, right? When I was leading the Environics Urban Aboriginal People Study, which still is Canada's largest research on Indigenous peoples in cities, we also interviewed non-Indigenous peoples on their attitudes towards, the attitudes of Canadians, to know what they thought about Indigenous peoples. And the majority, this was back in 2008, right? So we're going way back before 2021. The majority of Canadians received their information about Indigenous peoples from the media. And at that time, we were learning about children dying in the snow. You remember that? You know, those were the stories that were really prominent. And so we had this society who felt like we were all addicted, you know, we were all neglecting our children. When I started at the City of Vancouver as their first Indigenous relations manager, staff would tell me that the Indigenous community was in the downtown east side, that we are all street entrenched. And this was in 2014. And so the media had a significant role to play in shaping the attitudes of this country, and you were in the middle of it, educating them. And I know you talk about this in the book, but for those of you who have not read the book, and you should, because it's also an audiobook, right? So you can listen to it when you're getting ready in the morning and doing your dishes in the evening. What were your colleagues telling you about what they seen as the Indigenous issues that needed to be covered?
Like none? I mean, it would go something like this. And I think like people always ask, like, what changed? How did things change? And I always say, what was you? It was the audience, and it was metrics on our stories, right? So it would happen like this, for example, you're sitting in a room where there's maybe 2 people of color and then 11 white people and me. And I'm like, I think we should do a story on safe drinking water in Indigenous communities. And they're like, yeah. And then somebody, like this actually happened, somebody goes, well, I think the top story should be, I can't get my child into swimming lessons at the same time as my other child. And they're like, oh yeah, that's such a big issue right now, top story, right? And I'm like, weird. Like I'm not even, like, this is like the last thing on my mind right now. And then I would go online and say, hey, do people care about safe drinking water in Indigenous communities? And it'd be like 50,000 people going, yes, 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 yes. And people in the newsroom seeing that and being like, whoa, did you see Angela's tweet? Maybe we should cover this. Or, you know, my Maxwell Johnson story, for example, was declined when I first pitched it. They said, great story, sounds really complicated, but I'm going to take a pass. So luckily, I had allies who were producers who said, yes, we're going to cover that on all platforms. But that story on a grandfather and a granddaughter who were trying to open a bank account, who were arrested, that story had like 1 million hits. And you could see, right? We could see the metrics. You can see how many people are reading it. You can see how many people have read it. And you can see how long people are spending. So 1 minute and 59 seconds is like so long. Like no one reads a story for that long, seriously. People usually, it's like 36, 46 minutes is like the general amount of time people are perusing a story. And so people were like, oh, people care about Indigenous stories. And despite what journalists tell you, they want those clicks, they want those eyeballs on the story. That's, you know, a big reason for what they do what they do. And so that would raise the impetus of doing Indigenous stories. I mean, it was just, like thinking back, it was just brutal. The things that people just thought were normal, right? Making fun of my culture, literally like 2018 or 19, literally laughing in my face over a medicine bag I was wearing. Things that my colleagues didn't seem to think was like really harsh, but was really harsh for me. I think the younger folks are making a difference. Like I see them being like, I want to see more stories about missing and murdered Indigenous women covered without relying just on the police's account, but let's talk to actual family members, right? And so that gave me a lot of hope. But I mean, for years and years and years, it was crickets. I remember one time the producer, the assignment producer screwed up, and he assigned 2 reporters the same story. I won't say what part of the country this is because it's a small newsroom. So we did the exact same story. So it was a white woman and me doing a story on hand games. So hand games, it's like an Indigenous Lahal. Anyways, it's like a gambling game that's like very traditional. And so my story was just on like, it was super good. Like it had a lot of like data and stats, and it was very meaty, and it was about the culture and the gambling aspect of it. And it was super different than what the white woman wrote. So the white woman wrote, all of these Indigenous people are just getting rich off this gambling, and can you believe this kid? Like, he traveled across the country, and you know, he was paid like a flight from where this place is to the next place is like $2,000, and I think he was getting paid or he got the gambling fee or whatever for $1,200. So it was really this narrative that Indigenous people are so greedy, and mine was more about like the culture and the power of bringing this culture back. And so that's sort of what I witnessed throughout my life, is that there are these narratives that would be spun about Indigenous people being lazy, being incompetent, being greedy, being collapsing under colonial violence or trauma porn, and, you know, just me really pushing against the stereotypes. But I do have hope. I do have hope in some of the younger folks that are coming up that are wanting to do good stories and care and do like investigative stories, do rigorous journalism, not just take, you know, an institution's beliefs or side of the story on Indigenous people.
Yeah. It's so easy to maintain the status quo.
Oh, yeah.
Like, and I think that's why
It works so well.
Yeah.
It benefits white people so well. And I'm half white. So I'm light-skinned as well. Like, I see how this system benefits and privileges certain people and denies other people basic human rights. But it's so easy, right? It's so easy to just go along with the system. And it's so hard to make changes in those systems for some.
Yeah. Before the doors opened, we were having a conversation on like how uninformed our society has been, and uninformed and ignorant by design, right? Like, we weren't taught the history of residential schools. I didn't even know. My father attended a residential school until I was watching the Knowledge Network, and my uncle was on there talking about being in the residential school along with his brothers and sisters, including my dad, right? And so, like, we have a lot to reconcile with. But I feel like we know so much about the Indigenous context, right? We know the nations. You know, we can name, like, all of the nations in BC. You know, we have friends in First Nations communities, Indigenous and Métis communities all across this country. We know about the court cases. You know, we know who the Indigenous celebrities are and the authors and, you know, the designers. And by the way, for those of you who haven't been to Vancouver Indigenous Fashion Week, get tickets. They go on sale in a couple of days if you want to see Indigenous brilliance in its contemporary form, right? Like how we celebrate, how we show up, right? It's not just the trauma porn aspect of learning about us, right? So, like, there's so many ways to learn and get caught up to speed, and so much of that is experiential. And so you touched upon September 30th and the CIBC, sorry, like, have a nice holiday, That's gross. And it's really disappointing. Really disappointing. Because I actually work on every September 30th.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I feel like the only people working that day are Indigenous people.
Exactly.
Right? It's not a day off for us.
No.
You know, do you have some, do you have some ideas? Have you heard of good things that people have done to, I think, learn and acknowledge and experience? And these are the folks who are now our allies, right? Like folks who we've seen in our lives, who have been there with us, you know, over the years. We see them at events, you know, they're learning our worldviews, right? Like, can you tell us more about an average Canadian's progress from being uninformed to becoming an ally?
One thing that's interesting that I've witnessed a lot of is people really taking up the call to give land back, right? And so there's a number of people, a lot of elderly people on the island. I don't know why, but it seems to be all sort of in the island area, like Vancouver Island and some of the Gulf Islands, who are giving their land away for when they pass on, I guess, or moving away from their family home and giving that land back, and really consulting with nations about how to go about doing that. There was one woman who I was doing hide tanning with. She's a non-Indigenous woman, and she just went deep into her knowledge. She was like, well, how does that work? Like, how do we give land back as, you know, settler allies? Like, what does that look like? So she'd done this deep dive and was actually educating me, which was awesome. Like, come to the same tools, come to the table with the same tools as us, right? Like, come armed with ideas. And she was pointing me to, there's a website, I guess, like Cowichan Tribes has done, and it basically gives like choose your own adventure for land back. Like, there's like the property tax avenue. There's the like actually giving your, like, all these different ways to contribute to rectifying the wrongs of the past, right? And people really believing that. I mean, I am really in an incredible bubble. I don't surround myself by a-holes. So I have people, non-Indigenous people around me generating ideas like this all the time. And it's really exciting and empowering, and it's hopeful, right? But I think that's the biggest thing. I think looking inside of institutions, that's where it kind of goes dark, right? Like hearing about people working inside school boards, universities, the healthcare system, it's just like, oh, there's just so much harm. But hearing like individuals doing their own work to educate each other and take initiative, take action, that moves beyond just educating or learning or asking Indigenous people to educate them, that gives me a lot of hope. Yeah, and it's all ages, all backgrounds. It's hopeful.
And that seems really progressive, right? And that feels like justice, right? So I learned a definition of, like, what would it feel like when you finally have justice? And it was Adrienne Murray Brown, who is a Black activist, doula, facilitator in the US, and she said, you'll know justice is achieved when, like, the feeling of all of the injustices that you have felt are no longer there, because the justice is just so obvious, right? You're celebrating it, you're feeling it, you're living it. And it's easy to put the injustices aside because we really have moved on in all different ways.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. in my culture, we didn't really have a word for truth because it was just something that it was expected. We didn't need to talk about telling the truth. Like, it was just a value that was so innate. I actually named my son something purposely that was the opposite of a warrior. His name's Namawan, which means fair wind, and that's exactly what I wanted him to grow up feeling. It was just not having to think about fighting for justice, fighting for the truth, but just feeling and being able to live life without survival, and be able to grow and do beautiful things. And I think the Gen Z, like, I don't want to say this, like, knock on wood, because I feel like we were the generation, right, where it's like, you're the 7th generation, like, you got to make that change, and I don't know if we did that, but I do feel like the Gen Zs, all of them, they're doing things that really irk people, like, I need more time for my mental health, or I need some more time to think about that, and it's like, that's it. Like, rush culture is white supremacy. It's white supremacist time, right? When we're on this, like, crazy, like, the media was just ridiculous, what we were expected to do in a day. Absolutely no time for anything else but work. And I think the pandemic made us realize that, right? Like, man, this is not working. And it wasn't just, dysfunctional organizations. It was just like, why are we getting up at 5 a.m. and getting home at 6? And why are we doing all these things? It's unhealthy for our bodies, for our minds, for our hearts. And I remember contending, because I'm also a professor, with one of the other professors who was like, these Gen Zs, man, like, basically saying, like, if you don't like the heat, get out of the kitchen. And I was like, maybe they're the ones who are going to create a revolution, right? And disrupt these fricked up norms that we have, and they're going to push the status quo because they're fighting for their mental health. A lot of them aren't, like, I remember my stepdad going, it was so weird, we saw these 20-year-olds and they were just having like one cocktail. And I was like, it's probably because they don't have trauma. I remember everyone looked at me like so confused, and I was like, never mind I said that, but that has a lot to do with it, right? Like, growing up without trauma, you're not going to have to feel like you're in survival mode. You're going to be using your prefrontal cortex and living in your parasympathetic nervous system and in deregulation mode, and able to grow. And writing my second book, one of the things that I found really interesting too is they're not so focused on boyfriend, girlfriend, or partner or whatever. Like, they're just like, that's not even a thought. Like, they go to dances and they're on their phone. And people are like, oh, I can't believe it. And I'm like, it was kind of gross. Like, why were we, like, 9 years old, slow dancing with a guy? Like, it's weird. But we were so focused on, you have to get a partner, right? Like, you have to get married. And like, what would happen if we, like, didn't have that? And we're able to do other stuff, right? Like, as a collective, which is what our community did before colonization. The focus wasn't on the mom and the dad. It was on the uncles, the aunties, the grandparents. We operated as an entire community, and that's something that the colonials made fun of and mocked, right? Look at them all living together, right? And that's what sustained us. If you're having trouble with your kid, uncle's gonna take care of them, and the aunties are gonna stay with him. That was very normal for us. And that's something that I hope is happening right now, and it is. Apparently there's like 63% of people are no longer doing or maybe it's even 73% are not abiding by the nuclear family and are living in different situations. So I think the Gen Zs, I hope they're gonna shake things up. I have hope. Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah.
They're decolonizing themselves.
Without even saying that.
Yeah, without even saying it for sure.
Without even saying that.
Yeah. Do we have any questions in the audience? Any questions or comments? I know we're keeping you a little longer than we thought, but it's such a good conversation with Angela. So thank you for sticking around with us. have one here. Okay.
Because it's through coming to these events that has helped me dismantle so many of my beliefs, my understanding. It makes me aware so that I can speak to my grandchildren who are teenagers or preteens in a real true sense. And everything's on the table. And I love the knowledge and what the Indigenous people have taught me. But I'm also grateful to my mother who taught me about residential schools. She died at 100. And this goes back 60 years ago, 70 years ago, 70 or 80 years ago, that she was 70, that she was teaching me about what was going on and why the Indigenous communities were in trouble. And it was the missing children, and she had such deep respect. And the fact that the Indigenous people were the ones that allowed a lot of the settlers to live through the cold winters on the prairies. They would have frozen to death if it hadn't have been for the Indigenous knowledge and generosity. So thank you, thank you.
Thank you. That gives me hope when I hear things like that, because it's so rare, right? It's so rare for people to grow up. Like even my son's generation it was like, wow, you're learning about residential school in school? You know, he's 13 now, but so that's incredible that you have that knowledge or had that knowledge. It's hopeful.
Yeah, you sound like a great grandma.
Yeah.
Well, I feel like we could continue on in conversation for a lot longer, but I think we have the ability to do that in the next room over, where we have food and we have some beverages for everyone to enjoy. So those of you who have not yet picked up a copy of Unbroken, there are a number of copies available for sale at the top. Please do read it. It is phenomenal. And despite being nominated for like every award under the sun, you know, I feel like we're the country that likes to like let your first book slide no matter how brilliant it is, because we want you to come out with that second book, you know.
Which is coming.
Which is coming.
That's going to start a riot.
Yeah, it really will. She keeps saying that, and I'm looking forward to that riot. I'll be right there with you. Thank you, Angela Sterritt.
Thanks, Ginger.